The Open Window by Hector Hugh Munro. About the author. Hector Hugh Munro was an acclaimed writer who was born of English parents in Burma. He became a newspaperman in Russia and then in Paris. Then he started writing short stories under the pen name Saki. He was widely known by this name. He was gifted with much imagination, but at the same time, he was a realist. His stories are sometimes humorous, as for example, The Open Window, whereas some of them end with a shock, as for example, Dusk. Apart from writing stories, he wrote plays, a short novel, serials, and a fantasy set in the future. His works primarily revolve around contemporary culture and society. Summary of the story. The story begins with Frampton Nuttall, who visits the countryside for the treatment of his nerves. He didn't know anybody in that place, so his sister gave him some letters of introduction, hoping this would help him to get acquainted with a few people there. Once he reaches the country, he visits Mrs. Sappleton, where he meets her 15-year-old niece. She assures Mr. Nuttall that her aunt would be coming downstairs soon. Meanwhile, she inquires of him if he knows any people around that place. He mentions that his sister visited that place some 4 years ago and gave him some letters of introduction. On that account, he has come to visit Mrs. Sappleton. As Mr. Nuttall looks around the room, he realizes that the house is also inhabited by men. However, he is hesitant and wonders whether Mrs. Sappleton is a married woman or a widow. While he is lost in thoughts, the niece suddenly starts narrating that about 3 years ago her aunt's husband and her 2 younger brothers went out for shooting, but never returned. She points towards the large window that opens to a lawn. Further, she tells Mr. Nuttall that the men never came back as they were trapped in the swampy land and their bodies could not be recovered till death. She further says that her aunt, Mrs. Sappleton, always keeps this particular window open until it gets dark, hoping that her husband and brothers would return someday. Sometimes, even she feels that they would come through the open window, along with their dog in the same manner. Meanwhile, Mrs. Sappleton arrives and apologizes for being late. She also mentions her husband and brothers who have gone out shooting for birds. Besides, she tells Mr. Nuttall that she keeps the window wide open for them to enter the house so that they do not ruin the carpet with their mud-coated shoes. However, Mr. Nuttall feels a spooky air in the room and he tries to change the topic of discussion. But Mrs. Sappleton continues talking about shooting and the scarcity of birds in that area. Soon, Frampton realizes that she is looking towards the window while talking to him and not paying attention to him. Suddenly, she tells him that the men have returned from their shooting and are just on time for tea. This frightens Mr. Nuttall even more and he shivers with fear. He turns to look towards the girl for sympathy, but even the young girl was looking through the window with a horror in her eyes. Mr. Nuttall starts feeling uncomfortable and suddenly notices 3 figures carrying guns under their arms, walking across the lawn towards the open window. A dog is also coming along with them. Frightened, Mr. Nuttall quickly grabs his stick and hat and rushes out of the house. Finally, Mrs. Sappleton's husband walks into the room but is surprised why Mr. Nuttall hastened out of the room without meeting him. Mrs. Sappleton tells her husband that he is ill and rushed out of the house even without bidding a goodbye to anyone. The way he exits the room appears that he had seen some ghosts. To this, the girl states that Mr. Nuttall is afraid of dogs. She mentions how he was once attacked by dogs in a cemetery and he was so nervous that he had to spend the whole night in a newly dug grave with the dogs growling around him. Since then, he had a fear of dogs, and seeing their dog, he had made the lightning exit. Genre. What is genre? It is the type of art or literature. This particular story, The Open Window, is a short story. There are many features of a short story. Like, a short story is usually concerned with a single effect conveyed in only one or a few episodes or scenes. A short story has a simple plot and it omits a complex one. The characters are few, very few, and often disclosed in dramatic encounters or in actions, but seldom fully developed. The setting of a short story is often simplified, one time and place, and short stories of past often dealt with a central theme or a moral lesson. Let us focus on the characters of The Open Window. The Open Window has many major and minor characters. Vera, Frampton Nuttall, Mrs. Sappleton, Mr. Sappleton, two young brothers of Mrs. Sappleton, the sister of Mr. Frampton Nuttall, and the maid. Vera, the young girl of about 15, is the protagonist. Vera plays a cruel trick on Frampton. Her trick is based on a morbid joke. Still, she is presented as the protagonist of the story. She saves the reader from a boring tale of a boring adult house visit. Frampton Nuttall, a nervous man with an unspecified nervous disorder. Mrs. Sappleton, Frampton's host and Vera's aunt. The minor characters are Mr. Sappleton, two young brothers of Mrs. Sappleton, sister of Frampton Nuttall, and the maid. The setting of the short story is rural countryside. Narrative technique of the short story. It's third-person narration. The omniscient narrator functions almost as another character. Through him, Saki provides clues to the readers, thereby suggesting that Vera is not such a trustworthy storyteller. Were the story instead told from the perspective of Frampton or Vera herself, it might have been harder to dupe the readers. Irony of the story. Verbal irony. Vera's name is a play on the word veracity, meaning truth. Ironically, she is the trickster of the story, always spinning a new tale to her audience. Situational irony. Frampton retreats to the countryside in order to recover from a bout of nerves. Ironically, the countryside only adds to his anxiety, and Frampton is thrown into another nervous fit when he believes he has seen ghosts. The story features two levels: the main story and a story within the story. The tone and the mood oscillate between comically light and eerily dark. The story ends with the tone of the absurd as Frampton makes his lightning escape and Vera spins one more tale more outlandish than the first. Role of gender in this story. With the exception of Frampton, the characters that remain at home are all women, and those that go hunting are all men. Frampton's nerves may align him more with traditional and stereotypical portrayals of women in Saki's day. However, Saki also inverts a traditionally male-aligned role as trickster by attributing it to a young woman. Gender in The Open Window is thus an interesting reversal of traditional gender roles presented by Saki's contemporaries. Role of nature in this particular story, The Open Window. Nature is frequently presented as at odds with the human characters in the story. For example, Saki uses the landscape of the rural countryside as a setting for his macabre tale, showing that nature is not always peaceful and serene. It also has a darker side. The hunting party meets its supposed demise on account of poor weather conditions and a muddy bog. In the young girl's final tale, Frampton is also harassed by a pack of wild dogs. The symbolism of the window in the story. Vera uses the window as a means to escape the boring adult world and reimagine a more fantastical reality. To Vera, the window is a blank canvas. She uses it to create a world separate from the dull adult world she is forced to inhabit. The window is a representation of her desire to escape. It is a symbolic window to a different world through which Vera can travel into an alternate reality entirely of her own making. The window is a symbol of the aunt's hope that her husband and brothers will return. She views the window will bring back her loved ones. For Frampton, the window symbolizes the failure of his plan to find a respite in the rural countryside. Themes of this story. First theme, man versus nature. In Vera's first fabricated story, the hunters drown in a bog. In her second fabrication, several dogs chase Frampton Nuttall into an empty grave. So like many of Saki's stories, this one is also a battle between man and nature. Second theme, childhood. Childhood, a theme common in many of Saki's stories, is introduced in this story by Vera. Saki portrays childhood as an unfortunate state of children being trapped in a boring adult world. Vera is under the watch of the aunt, an imposing figure from whom she desires escape and achieves it through imaginative storytelling and trickery. Next theme, desire to escape. Both Frampton and Vera possess a strong desire to escape. Vera seeks escape from the adult world she inhabits through her imagination and storytelling. She uses some tall tales as a means of escapism from life in the boring adult world. Frampton is brought to the rural town out of a desire to escape and recover from his nerve disorder. While Vera's escape proves fruitful and entertaining, Frampton's is not so successful. It provokes more chaos than calm. Yet another theme is storytelling. Saki commonly uses the story within a story technique in his works. He takes this a step farther in The Open Window by using Vera as storyteller to convey a theme about storytelling as an art form. So that was all about the short story The Open Window, written by Hector, Hugh, Munro, or Saki. If you still have any doubt, please let me know in the comment section below. And thanks for watching.